So,
this was a crazy one.
yeah. Although it was another.
I
one
wanted to text you every time I was reading it, like, what the hell? But I thought we would just save it for the podcast.
Yeah, I was pretty confused. I'm not gonna lie.
I think about halfway through, it started to click.
I agree.
It was kind of the experience. I don't know if you've ever gone to a Shakespeare play, but it sort of takes a little bit of time to acclimate to it. And so the first 5 or 10 minutes, you're a little bit like, what are they saying? And then you get used to it.
I mean, I would say maybe that's my analogy would have been the Insane Clown Posse, but you want to be pretentious, sure.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I was just thinking about it because I actually have a Shakespeare quote to bring up today in regards to the reading, so.
Yeah, no, I mean, so we're reading Judith Butler's Gender Trouble.
Yeah, she's trying to make gender trouble.
Yeah, 1990, a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny. I'm wondering if this book is one of the books that started the trend of saying problematic.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I just remember I had to read some of it for my master's.
Do you remember what part you read?
I don't remember, actually. I was looking through the chapters. None of the titles sound familiar, but all the content is familiar. Like, I've read this stuff before. So maybe it was this first section, actually.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I guess to summarize it quickly before we get into it, she's essentially doing what she's working in lines of what Nietzsche and Foucault were doing.
Right.
Where, starting with Nietzsche, who was attempting to do a genealogy of morals, which is essentially looking at morality. And I guess this is, I never thought about it in this frame, but I guess that is what he was doing, is looking at morality and the systems that shape it, and in his case, Christianity and whatnot.
Right.
And then Foucault, of course, was doing it with respect to, well, I mean, a lot of things, but, how civilization looked at madness and then sexuality.
Right.
And so now she's doing that with gender.
Yes. And
yeah, I feel like ultimately what she's trying to do is show how, the the heteronormative structure shapes gender and how gender really isn't an identity, essentially, it sounds like. I mean, that seemed to be one of the one thing
she
that
says
she kept
at the end
kind
of what her goal is.
Yes. Wonder if we have the same spot.
Yeah, I mean, just the last couple sentences of the first chapter. Because she says, no longer believable as interior truth of dispositions and identity, sex will be shown to be a performatively enacted signification, and hence to not be one that, released from its naturalized interiority and surface, can occasion the parodic and proliferation and subversive play of gendered meanings. This text continues then as an effort to think through the possibility of subverting and displacing those naturalized and reified notions of gender that support masculine hegemony and heterosexist power, to make gender trouble, not through the strategies that figure a utopian beyond, but through the mobilization, subversive confusion, and proliferation of precisely those constitutive categories that seek to keep gender in its place by posturing as foundational illusions of identity. So basically, it's to destabilize and subvert the entrenched powers of defining gender identity as they stand.
Right.
So it's, to me, it's the project isn't Foucault and Nietzsche. The project is Marx, and the techniques are Foucault and Nietzsche.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely Marxian, and she makes a lot of Marxist references and talks about reification, as we just said.
I think actually it's I think it's almost 1-to-1. As I was reading, there's a section I highlighted that we can talk about where she talks about how the law of the father, the patriarchal law, is providing the framework for the subversion of it, which is essentially maps 1-to-1 on the capitalist and proletarian revolution.
Well, and she talks about, at some point, she says something about how, following in line with the cultural critique as Marx did or something along those lines. And so I completely agree.
It makes sense because she's considered a postmodernist, which is the marriage of critical theory and postmodernism.
I see. Yeah, because what I liked about reading this was it was emblemizing very well what I was trying to say when we were reading the Foucault. Mm-hmm. That, Foucault was the start of a lot of this. And then you had brought up the good point that, the critical theorists were also, and when I say all of this, I'm talking about, we have all these questions in our society about gender, sex, what is a woman, right? And stuff like that. And you can see, she references Foucault
a lot
in this. And his specifically his history of sexuality. Mm-hmm. And but no, I agree. I think it's certainly Marxian.
I think that's what the aim is. The project is the Marxist project.
Yeah, sure. I won't quibble about this. If you want to say it's more Marxian than it's Nietzschean,
I don't think it's more. I'm not saying it's more. I'm saying.
What are you saying? No,
I'm saying that's what she
techniques.
wants. What does Judith Butler want the world to be? That's what I'm saying.
Yes, and I agree. In a sense, she is a little. She's not actually that overt about it until this last part. I would say she's very much more Foucaultian in that, in most of the chapter, where she's kind of laying out a lot of these theories of Wittig and
Irigaray or Irigaray, depending on it's like I've heard it pronounced in French, and then these Beauvoir,
these major feminist writers who wrote on gender theory before.
Right.
She was sort of laying out their theses and then talked about Foucault as well. Mm-hmm. And not really offering up what her opinion was. She did in the beginning, and certainly did at the end. And in her prologue or whatever, the preface, she talks about that too, because she starts by talking about how I was never a troublemaker or something like that, but now I realize it's it's time to stir the pot, essentially.
Right.
So you could get into that, can't you?
Sure.
You like stirring the pot.
Get into it, yeah.
You love stirring pots.
Yeah. She's also in the critical studies department at
UC
at
Berkeley?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Are we going to visit her?
I don't know.
In a nice way, I'm saying.
Yeah, of course. I wouldn't want to be not nice to her.
Well, I know. It's just, it can sound ominous.
No, yeah.
In this crazy time that we live.
Right. Yeah.
So here's what I like about it. Because there's things. First off, I think with Hoppe, I think I'll probably refrain a lot of my opinions until we read more, because I still I think I get what she's doing, but
there could be a twist.
Have some. Yeah, exactly. For all I know, it's
surprise
M. Night
ending.
Shyamalan. Yeah. So, but what I like about it is I am all for obviously rethinking things. I'm going to bring in consciousness into this one. I apologize. No, I don't apologize.
Well, no, I have a question, because she brings it up a couple times in little ways. Yeah. So I have a question for you.
Well, and of course, I think this whole gender trouble stuff it's all consciousness is at the basis of it, of course. But, we don't have to get into it yet. We've talked about consciousness a lot, so we should talk about other stuff. But just know that I think that looking at it through that lens helps make things clearer, in my opinion. So I like the fact that she's rethinking things. I think that's always good. I think people should always be sort of asking these kind of questions about, where they're at. I still am wondering where does this lead? you know, because it feels like if you tear down all foundations, then you have almost insanity. Like there's no, like the human seems to need some grounding, and it doesn't have to be the grounding that we have now, but it feels like we're saying there's no humans shouldn't be grouped at all. And maybe that's true, but I don't know. I mean, you also have people wanting to be grouped. So, you know, I don't know. And I guess maybe that's it. It comes down to the will, as don't group me without my consent.
Right.
As, you know, an anarchist might think. So anyway, I like the fact that we're reevaluating things. I think that's always good, and I think that is healthy. Mm-hmm. What do you think about stuff?
About reevaluating? I think
no, just anything.
I think reevaluating is fine. I would say that she has a few primary modes, and sort of like theses that she's using to form the reevaluation. There's a lot of work on grammatical evaluation of how things are described. I think the easiest one to wrap your head around is the idea of gender is not something that you are. Gender is a process. It's performative.
The boulevard.
So, right. So you are not a man or a woman. You are not masculine or feminine. These are not attributes, but these are ongoing processes that you perform.
Right. Beauvoir's claim.
Right.
That one is not born, but rather becomes a woman.
Right. And the reason I'm using perform is that's one of Butler's big words. Yeah.
Well, and she uses it a lot too.
Beauvoir.
Oh, sorry. Butler is her. Yeah, sorry. For some reason, I thought it was you were talking about somebody else.
No, because Beauvoir has the becoming a woman, and Butler talks about how becoming the implications of that process are that it doesn't have a beginning and an end, but it is an ongoing set of actions or performances.
Yeah. By the way, I've realized not to get we're starting to pick up some good steam here, Antushka.
Oh,
but I've realized. Brother X had a good suggestion.
Yes.
And I've been meant to say it at the outset of the episode.
Oh, good.
That we should encourage people to write to us.
Oh, yes.
Like email us.
Oh, I thought you meant letters, handwritten.
Well, they could do that too, but
you have to find our address.
Email. Well, I mean, we have an email. Here, let me get it.
Yes.
What is our email?
plausibledeniabilityamx@gmail.com.
Yeah.
It's just the name of the show at gmail.com.
It's the name
we
of
have a Gmail.
Exactly.
We're sellouts. We're losers.
We are losers.
We should have our own server. What is going on here?
But yeah, we want to hear from you. Tell us why you like us, why you hate us, if you think we should read stuff. If you want to come on the podcast, we'll even entertain that. We're going to be having a bunch of guests on in the coming weeks.
That's going to get crazy.
It's going to get super crazy. And we have to decide whether we want to keep how we're going to do the anonymity thing. I imagine with your friends, the Reckless Muse, we'll probably just use their names. But I have a friend coming on, and I told him he can either be his real name or if he wants to come up with a pseudonym. Yeah.
I think it's all letters. It's like a version of Reservoir Dogs. We'll have like Mr. N and Mr. T.
Oh, he can be Mr.
Instead of colors, we do letters.
Mr. T.
Yeah, right. Mr. T. Wait, we have Mr. T. When we get in trouble, is that libelous?
I wonder. I had a turtle named Mr. T when I was a kid. That was my first pet.
Oh, that's pretty funny.
Mr. T.
Yeah.
He's a good man.
Right. It's a cute name for a turtle, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, so I just say that. plausibledeniabilityamx@gmail.com.
Yeah, .com. Remember the .com part. It's not .edu.org, nothing like that.
No. Edu? Is that what you said?
Yeah, edu, edu.
Yeah, I know. I've just...
Like education, but just the first part.
Yeah, I get it. It's just, I've never heard anybody say it like that. You are one of a kind, Antushka.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And so, and also, we're just back to us, too. Me and you.
Yeah.
You and me.
And the turtles, yeah.
And the turtles. And, we're coming up on 15 years of sensual friendship.
Yeah. Okay. Should we stop talking about Judith Butler? Let's get into this. Shower cheese, man.
I forgot about that. How could I forget about that? The shower cheese. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, well, moving on.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So, how have we been performing our gender for the last 15 years?
I think pretty heteronormatively.
Yeah, probably.
Especially you.
Yeah. Probably. Anyway, so gender as a performance. So that was the first. I was saying that's the kind of easiest point to wrap your head around. Another big point that I've been sort of grappling with, as they say in academia, over the last couple days, is the issue of the disillusion of subject-predicate relationships. And so she talks about how when she actually brings up Nietzsche and the genealogy of morals to discuss the idea of how actions don't have doers. And she goes on to talk about culture, and I think this comes out of the idea of culture sort of having primacy in the sort of system of causal relations, that subjects are not actually enacting things, but the description of subjects enacting things is a post hoc sort of fantasy or fiction.
Yeah, and then, because they're talking about how, like, the way that Descartes came to his I think, therefore I am is grammatically.
Right. And this is where I start to, it's A, I don't really understand what they mean, and B,
I don't either.
I think it's nonsense. I think it doesn't make sense. Like, I think it's not it's not sound or something like that. There was an interesting comment I found on YouTube on a Judith Butler video, because somebody put up an audiobook of this on YouTube, and I was looking through the comments, and most of them were either love this or Judith Butler's the devil. Just silly stuff. But this was actually a pretty interesting comment that I think is maybe worth talking about on this topic. So this was...
you have to give him credit.
Yeah. This is at Purple Spotted Kangaroos 9956. So nice. Thanks for the good comment. At Purple Spotted Kangaroos 9956. It says, it's kind of long, but I think it's worth talking about. I think my problem is that Butler's thesis appears to be incredibly limited in its effectiveness. If we are to abandon the subject-object dichotomy of representation, then aren't we severely handicapping our ability to view the problem in anything other than the broadest possible strokes? How can marginalized groups advocate on behalf of a we if said we/I cannot be coherently defined? So I think this is a huge problem, because when they're talking, when in the Nietzsche section, and then is Haas his name? H-A, or the person writing on Nietzsche, who she quoted.
Yeah, Haas. H-A-S-S or something.
Probably H-A-A-S?
Oh, H-A-A-R.
Har. Yeah. Was talking
Michael
about
Har.
Sort of grammatical illusions and things like that. And so my biggest question is, who is holding this illusion if there are no subjects?
Yeah,
what does an illusion mean without a subject?
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, so Purple Spotted Kangaroos 9956 continues. If parity is constituted in opposition to a contradictory truth, to what extent is parity as a mode of deconstruction subordinate to the very thing it is attempting to denaturalize? Doesn't drag, he uses drag as an example, insist upon an original gendered subject in order to provide a heightened rendition of an inversion? Let's take, for example, the image of a drag queen. could it be argued that the exaggerated feminine aesthetic expression the queen takes on during her moment of drag, contrary to exposing an artificiality at the core of gendered sex bodies, produce laughter on the basis of the conflict between the performance of gender and the reality of sex? The double contradiction of drag only works if we presuppose that the interior of the performer is indeed feminine. Drag has been, and to a lesser capacity, currently very much still is, a factus of heteronormative culture. He goes on a little bit later. It's then necessary to distinguish between queer and cishet variations of drag, where the performer is defined by the supposed feminine interiority. Could that not lead to these modes of deconstruction being written off as an expectation to the well-accepted rule, displaced to the very fringes of legible identities? He goes on. It's a lot longer, but I think overall it's
a long comment.
I mean, I think it's a good comment. It's bringing up a good point, and actually it's related to a section that I had a question on, where she was talking about sexual roles taken on in gay and lesbian relationships mirroring heterosexual roles. You're talking about sort of butch and femme sort of sexual roles and things like that being reproductions, and that fact in and of itself proving, according to Butler, that the heterosexual roles are constructions rather than natural or originals. So it's a copy of a copy, and I don't understand how that proves that at all, because to me that could be true. It doesn't mean it isn't true, but I don't see how you could know that because one thing is copying another, the first thing is also a copy.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. And I think all of this gets to a comment that, she makes on page 41. The return to biology as the ground of a specific feminine sexuality or meaning seems to defeat the feminist premise that biology is not destiny.
Right.
So I think that's at the heart of a lot of this.
Right.
And this whole, it's, to your point about the Marxist thing, it's sort of like a revolution against the norms, every norm that we have, subject-object norm.
Right. Well, and that's what Marx says, right? It's a revolution against every entrenched structure.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but I agree. I mean, the fact that you see these patterns, and this is going to be, I think, ultimately what my critique of this is, it's just I need to read more to make sure that she doesn't address it, is that I think that these patterns exist because they are natural, probably.
Right.
I mean, and the fact that they're not uniform across nature doesn't mean that they're not still significant patterns, because in biology you never have anything that's completely without variance,
right? But
you have normal curves, and so this is something I often get into a discussion with my one sociology friend in particular about, is sort of, there's like a lot of people that I think subscribe to this sort of thing end up, if they're thinking logically, to the end of like, we have to push back against Bayesian probability, or maybe it's non-Bayesian. Anyway, the idea of, I think, normal curves and stuff,
right?
Because I think that's really the one thing that you can use to combat this theory, is the fact that there are, when you take statistics, I actually misspoke a few episodes ago. I was talking about, I mean, they're interrelated concepts, but there's these two concepts that you learn about when you learn statistics. You learn about the law of large numbers, and you learn about the central limit theorem. The law of large numbers, if you take enough, if you basically sample something enough, it will converge on its true norm. And then the central limit theorem is that basically everything converges to a Gaussian or normal curve. And this, so Gaussian curve is that you have most of your samples are going to be around a specific norm, and then you have a very clear sort of drop off that's defined by a certain standard deviation. And the fact is, I'm getting into all of this because I just think that this is people, I think, when they push against science generally and sort of normative things, I mean, the word norm is used all over the place, which comes from the normal curve, in my opinion. I mean, that's what they're saying. You can't, it's hard to define things by their extremes. And so they bring up the Foucault example of the hermaphrodite.
Right.
And it's like, it's not, gender isn't trying to say that these people don't exist and whatnot, but it's trying to say that most people fit within this certain normal curve. And
I think she would agree with that.
Yeah,
because I mean that's just like Beauvoir and Wittig's other situation, that hermaphrodite is it's fractal. It works for women and it also works for the hermaphrodite category or the transgender category or whatever, that it's defined in opposition to a norm, and that is the critique.
But I'm not saying that they don't fall within this. What I'm saying is that outliers are still part of the curve. That's essentially what I'm saying, is that a normal curve is going to have, 68% of the population in a very tight place around the mean, but then you're going to have a drop off, and you'll have sort of outliers, if you want to call them, or just extreme values at the end. And so I feel like where people have an issue is when you start to discount these people and you bully them and whatnot, which I agree. It's like, we don't have to do that, obviously.
Right.
But to say that certain distributions don't exist within nature, I think is a fool's end. But that's, again, that's the empiricist.
And so I feel like that's where the big distinction is.
Right.
Because I think that the argument is that what you're saying is a curve, that is already a cultural construction. A norm is a cultural construction. A distribution is a cultural construction. So, some piece of culture, some piece of heteronormative culture has constructed this idea of who's normal and who's not.
But that's the question, is if you sample enough cultures and you see this pattern in enough cultures.
But you've already defined it, because she even addresses this when she talks about the idea of universal oppression. Right, and how it's dangerous to even say universal oppression, because you're defining oppression in a Western cis het blah blah
in
way.
An imperialistic way.
Right.
She starts talking about that.
Right, and so it's turtles all the way down. It breaks down at every step, which is I think why she goes to the level of subject predicate. It goes all the way down to subject object.
Where then I would again say, you see subject object in not just Western culture, but all over, the species. And so does that mean that it's something intrinsic to our physiology?
Right. Maybe.
To me, that means it. Yes, it does.
Right.
Well, I mean, you say maybe, but I mean,
I don't mean maybe, and I think you're wrong. I'm saying maybe, like I think you might be right.
Yeah. But I mean, this is the big thing. And I mean, this is where consciousness comes in, I think. Because I think...
Okay, we should call this podcast, how many different ways can we think to introduce consciousness?
No, but what is... A conscious individual is trying to rebel against the biology. The consciousness is almost like it works in opposition to the body. It doesn't want to be... constrained by the body. That's why I thought this point that was made about how the feminist premise that biology is not destiny.
Right.
I think that only comes from an individual that's hyper-conscious and doesn't want to be constrained by their body. Doesn't want to be constrained by societal norms. It doesn't want to be constrained by any of these things. It has will, and it wants to enact its will however it feels that it should be. And that's why I think it's central to this conversation.
Right.
And I think that we have in academia, you have very conscious individuals who, like Judith Butler,
right,
who are looking at the world and like, don't tell me how to be. It's like, I know how I am and I know how I want to fit in. And yeah, so, anyway. But we'll talk about it more.
No, I think what you're saying is good. I'm looking for the consciousness bit. There's that paragraph I highlighted that I wanted to ask you about.
Yeah.
But no, I think what you're saying, makes sense. I think, though, that this theory that not just Judith Butler's theory, but all forms of argumentation like this are essentially trying to argue consciousness away. And I think that is what the idea of there not being a doer, there not really even being will. She makes a point, and I don't remember what it is, about will and how will is sort of like a fictive construction or something like that. I don't remember what her exact term was.
I see what you're saying. I think both can be true. It's a conscious attempt to explain it away.
Yeah, of course. I think that the act of writing this book is a highly conscious act, and I think that what the argumentation is trying to do is trying to argue away consciousness,
which is interesting. Yeah,
which has been my your bent is consciousness. My bent is that there's some division. And, like left-right is a way that it kind of sort of works in a lot of situations, but it's not just left-right. It's
I don't know if it does. You're saying left-right for hyper and less conscious? What are you
what I mean is there is something common to many people on the political left and many people on the political right having to do with an acceptance of an objective and a rejection of an objective universe. And to me, this is almost as extreme as you could possibly get, because this is rejecting both an objective universe and a subjective. Because this is even saying outright that there is no subjective. There is no subject.
Right. And
this is like oblivion. This is where I say that Foucault, at its root, is nothingness. It's not even. It's the opposite of an objective universe. It's like a black hole.
It's nirvana.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah, I think so.
Which, yes, I agree, is non-conscious.
Right.
And I agree. Yeah, you had all those in the Madness and Civilization book that Foucault wrote. All of those, while he wasn't explicitly saying he liked it, he was sort of writing like he liked it, of, the insane individual who was able to sort of look at the world as a whole and sort of non-subjectively and whatnot. So I would agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And here's why I think that might be the case, is because I think, to your point that you've made, I thought was a really good point. That's why I clipped it. It's like, I think that when people become too conscious, they try to find ways to become less conscious.
Right. Sure.
And I think Foucault, I think he was probably a highly conscious person.
Mm-hmm.
I think Judith Butler probably is too.
Right.
And I think I am. It's just, for some reason, I keep leaning into it.
Yeah.
And I think I'm getting you to lean into it more, and I think you're hating it.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know, man.
Okay, anyway. I had, unless you were still, if you found that sentence, I
did find it, but I think you've addressed it well. So.
Okay. So, on the topic of just where I felt like she laid out what she was trying to do very well, I thought this was a good couple sentences. So this is on page 45. The presumption here is that the being of gender is an effect, an object of a genealogical investigation that maps out the political parameters of its construction in the mode of ontology. To claim that gender is constructed is not to assert its illusoriness or artificiality, which I thought was kind of an interesting thing to say.
Yeah.
Where those terms are understood to reside within a binary that counterposes the real and the authentic as oppositional. As a genealogy of gender ontology, this inquiry seeks to understand the discursive production of the plausibility of that binary relation and to suggest that certain cultural configurations of gender take the place of the real and consolidate and augment their hegemony through the felicitous self-naturalization.
Right.
So, again, she's talking about how she's trying to look at it genealogically like Nietzsche and like Foucault, and trying to show the cultural impacts of gender. But I thought that point, to claim that gender is constructed, is not to assert its illusoriness or artificiality.
Right.
That actually kind of surprised me, because I often felt like she was trying to say that, like it is artificial, by saying it's constructed.
I don't really even know what she means by that, because constructed and artificial sound very similar to me. Because I can imagine artificial not being a negative term.
Well, I think it might get to this point that, and maybe this is why I want to hold judgment a little bit, because maybe we'll agree more than I think, is that you can have natural constructs, can't you?
I don't know.
Like, if you find, and maybe, I don't know, I guess my first question would be, do they believe anything's natural? And in my head, what's natural is if you just had an unconscious being doing something.
Like a rock rolling down a hill.
Like a rock rolling down a hill, or we would call, like a dog chasing after a ball or whatever, or rather a dog chasing after a rodent, I suppose, is where it actually is. You know what I mean? Like
where they're acting on instinct rather than acting on volition.
Exactly. And they're not acting on the volition of a conscious individual.
Right.
Because again, I think that's what these people are really trying to tease out, in some sense, whether or not they're wanting to, but it feels like they're trying to tease out what are the things that conscious individuals have imprinted on society, and how can we get out of those cages?
Right.
Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that that's part of it. I think for sure. I think that when we're reading like anything like this, like any feminist theory, it has self-proclaimed political goals too, though.
Well, the political goal yes, you're right. She explicitly talks about how this is a political sort of endeavor, and in this sense, the political goal is that, the conscious individuals that have made society are also holding people in that state,
right,
through power.
Yes.
Which I certainly was the case when she was writing this. I think it's less the case now, and I think, in fact, in some interesting ways, the power balance have shifted.
Huh.
Yeah, you've even talked about this, how it's like there's... Yeah, but I don't know. Anyway.
I don't know that I agree that in 1990 the crafters of society were the ones holding power, because I think the problem with any statement like that, she makes it all through the chapter, is that we don't know who crafted the society, because nobody crafted the society. Right. It's not like it was one guy or 100 guys. It's not like we have a list.
But it was, in their opinion, guys.
In their opinion, right? But they're just saying that,
right?
Like Thaddeus Russell has a whole history critiquing that exact construction, and I'm not saying he's right or they're right, but a lot of the statements in this chapter are things. I made notes where it's like they feel like you're just saying something, and I don't know. It could be true and it could be false. It's like the copy and original thing. And right. I don't see how it's even possible to determine one way or the other.
Well, and it was also, I don't know if you had this, but this was one of the ones where it's like it was a real slog for me to get through.
It's very, very difficult to read. I would have to stop and read a sentence again and again.
Me too.
Like, what? It would just be like, completely incomprehensible to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, I can't even disagree with it because I don't know what it's saying.
Yeah, but I did learn a new fun word, Phallogocentrism.
Oh, yeah.
That's Derrida's
What about
word,
medical, juridical?
Oh, yeah. Nah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean the phallogocentrism, which just, I guess, from a male phallic standpoint, which was what was her name? Irrigere. Yeah.
So, sorry.
No. Yeah, go for it.
So the part 2, where she addresses the sex portion of it, because we've talked about that in the past, about how there's a common refrain in sort of popular parlance around gender politics, that gender is culturally constructed, but sex is biological. Mm-hmm. And then I was saying that's not where the social science is there. That's like just something they say on, I don't know, like BuzzFeed or something like that.
Yeah.
And so the critical theory as it stands today, and as it has stood for decades now, is that not only is gender constructed socially, culturally, but sex is as well. And actually, because gender is, sex is, because she argues that sex is actually a subsidiary category to gender, because sex is about gender. And so because gender is socially constructed, sex must be socially constructed.
So that's interesting, because I also got the impression reading this part, I have a note saying her theory seems to rest on separating sex from gender. And I think it's on page 9. Mm-hmm. Let me see if this answers that. If gender is the cultural meanings that the sexed body assumes, then a gender cannot be said to follow from a sex in any one way. Taken to its logical limit, the sex/gender distinction suggests a radical discontinuity between sexed bodies and culturally constructed genders. Mm-hmm. First off, I have, why is this true? Because that's another thing that I think...
well, it could be worth just going through that slowly.
Well, I guess maybe I should read before. Let me read before that. I mean, it's the first paragraph.
We can read this whole
Let's just
section.
read the book. Yeah. Although the unproblematic unity of women is often invoked to construct a solidarity of identity, a split is introduced in the feminist subject by the distinction between sex and gender. Originally intended to dispute the biology is destiny formulation, the distinction between sex and gender serves the argument that whatever biological intractability sex appears to have, gender is culturally constructed. Hence, gender is neither the causal result of sex nor as seemingly fixed as sex. Mm-hmm. The unity of the subject is thus already potentially contested by the distinction that permits of gender as a multiple interpretations of sex. And then it goes into, if gender is the cultural meaning that the sex body assumes, then a gender cannot be said to follow from a sex in any one way. So if gender is the cultural meanings...
Mm-hmm. Right. So gender is separate from sex. So she's starting by separating gender as a concept from sex. Gender is not downstream of sex at all. They're separate variables.
Right, and that's because originally intended to dispute the biology as destiny formulation, the distinction between sex and gender serves the argument that whatever biological intractability sex appears to have, gender is culturally constructed, hence gender is neither the causal result of sex nor as seemingly fixed as sex. That doesn't seem to necessarily follow in my head.
Well, it's because the previous section, she lays out why gender is culturally constructed.
Yeah.
So we're taking that as, she's kind of already laid out the arguments for that.
Yeah, and I know she goes on to talk about how, like, gender in some ways is like sex and gender and what was the third thing? Desire?
Yes.
Sexual desire, like molded into one. That's how some people look at it, which So, and certainly she's trying to tease those out, which I think is a perfectly fair thing to do. But maybe I just didn't really understand how, I guess I just still don't understand how they're completely separate.
Yeah, I don't think that the case is made well. I think it's one of these things that she's just asserting. And I don't think her X therefore Y therefore Z follows at all. But so she starts off this section, as I understand it, by separating the variables. You have sex and gender, and those things are different. And then she concludes the section by wrapping it around and saying, actually, sex is also culturally constructed because sex is referred to through gender, so sex is ultimately downstream from gender, not the other way around. There's some quotes I have here. Are the ostensibly natural facts of sex discursively produced by various scientific discourses in service of other political and social interests? So there's a question she's posing. If the immutable characteristic of sex is contested, perhaps this construct called sex is actually as culturally constructed as gender. Indeed, perhaps it was always already gender, with the consequence that the distinction between sex and gender turns out to be no distinction at all. It would make no sense then to define gender as the cultural interpretation of sex, if sex itself is a gendered category. Gender ought not to be conceived merely as the cultural inscription of meaning on a pre-given sex, which she calls a juridical conception. Gender must also designate the very apparatus of production whereby the sexes themselves are established. As a result, gender is not to culture as sex is to nature. Gender is also the discursive and cultural means by which sex nature or a natural sex is produced and established as a pre-discursive prior to culture, a politically neutral surface on which culture acts.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I agree in a sense that like everything like that we talk about with language is culturally determined.
Right.
But I think if we're talking about
like the words we're using.
Yeah, the words we're using are always going to be culturally determined.
Yeah.
Exactly. I feel like that's essentially what she's proving by saying all these things. Like even she's talking about how sex is referred to by gender and stuff like that. That all seems to just be a tautology in some sense, right? She's proving it, and so I mean, if we're looking at it from that perspective, yes, our vocabulary is shaped culturally, but it doesn't say that there aren't sort of truths beneath, like groups, right?
Right.
If you were to look at it,
but I think that her argument is that gender as a concept comes before sex as a concept. She's saying that the idea that there is such a thing as binary sex, male and female, is used as a way to uphold like a cis-hetero framework. But that actually that binary is just like artificially created after the idea of gender. And the idea of gender is not binary.
Do you remember what evidence she's using to prove that?
It's just
because it's like to me, you would have to look at that anthropologically.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the next chapter will talk more about that.
Yeah, you're probably right.
And I think it'll be a lot of there's some culture that does gender differently. There are examples of intersex, hermaphrodite.
Right.
It'll be that.
Right. And then that's where I'll come in and talk about the normal curve again.
It's just not going to work on her.
Well, you can hate it, but it's like it doesn't mean it's not a thing. That's the problem. This is why people don't like science, right?
Right.
A lot of people don't, because it does take away it feels like it's taking away will, right? Mm-hmm. If you're saying, okay, well, we just naturally tend to group in these ways. Because you could even say that culture is natural. I mean,
I think that's the closest thing she would say. A lot of the like post-structuralism stuff is that the only deterministic factor is culture. So there's no such thing as a scientific truth. There's such thing as a culture that believes in scientific truth.
Right, but culture is natural because it appears to come out de novo without anybody trying.
Right, but like the idea that a normalization curve, that's just something that this particular society believes in.
We should really have somebody on that like knows about this. Sure. Not that we're not doing a good job. It's just I have so many questions.
Right. Well, what are your questions?
I mean, I've asked them already, and I think you're right. Hopefully she'll address them. But, I guess the basis that they're using, that they're founding a lot of these things on, I feel like it wasn't laid out that clearly in this first chapter.
Right.
The basis for how gender is downstream of sex, like that didn't seem, and this is something I was saying, is it feels like she's making a lot of assumptions and then building off of those assumptions.
Right.
It's like a lot of if, then.
Yes, because she asks a question, and then she says, if this turns out to be true, then this. She does it through the whole chapter. I know. It's
right.
But she hasn't demonstrated that it is true. It's just, if that's true. And then I don't even agree with her or I don't agree with her conclusion if that's true. Because to me, if that's true, a million things are possible.
This is just a funny aside, but, so I'm reading a used version of the book, and it's always just interesting to see how I could tell that this book was owned by like a college student that just didn't really like care or understand what you're supposed to highlight, because they just highlighted the most random things. Like they highlighted, and what is sex anyway? I mean, which is like, it's true. It's a central question, but it's like, it's interesting to highlight the almost rhetorical questions and not like the points that are like, around that. It's just funny. Does sex have a history? Another question they highlighted.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's fine. Right. I'm just trolling the previous owner of this.
Yeah, I think she. I don't remember if it's in this book. I think she also has a paper going into scientific argumentation, like refuting.
Maybe we could get her on the podcast.
Refuting. Yeah, I don't think so. But maybe Judith.
If you're out there
two white,
listening.
Very straight men.
Very straight. Well, hang on. I don't know about very straight.
I just mean I like present like it's just like just such a like it's just such an energy.
Don't forget about that shower cheese.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway. The thing is, I have a lot of critiques also, but it also feels like sort of pointless to get into the weeds and everything. Mm-hmm. There's a few that I just have like question marks, like what does this mean? And I think that the problem is some of it is just you have to go over and over and over and over it. And I think it's easier to understand when you zoom out, because actually when I was asking my wife about it, who studied some of this stuff in college, not Judith Butler, but McKinnon, who Butler talks about in her preface, who's a big feminist theory writer, who has similar idea, actually has a whole concept of how all heterosexual sex is rape, which is a fun one.
She must be great at parties.
Yeah. Anyway, I think my wife has an easier time understanding it because she's able to like not get caught up in the like what is a. There was some term that I kept getting caught up on. It was like the masculine signifying economy.
Oh, yeah.
And I kept reading it, and I kept like trying to parse out what that means, and I looked it up, and I just got directed to more Judith Butler papers, and it was like, I do not really, like, I would have a hard time putting into other words what that means. And and things like that. And but for her, she's it's easier for her to see what the broad picture is, because what she's doing is she's saying what is the point of the text? Why is Judith Butler writing this text, and what is it responding to? And then it's saying, like, oh, this is in response to ideas of like erasure of women and all these things. Because the other one that was confusing me was Irigary's theory that women are not defined as other with respect to a masculine universal, but they are not defined at all. They're like non-existent, which I had a very hard time understanding what that even meant. Because you're talking about confusing. A category. How could you say a category that you've named and claim that it doesn't exist and doesn't have a definition?
Well, it's interesting because like later on, she also talks about how it's like it sounded more like it was just defining it completely separate from men as its own thing.
Right.
Because, and then that was in opposition to Wittig, who was... Wittig had that theory that, like, lesbian...
That was way more comprehensible to me. Like, whether I agree with all parts of it, I can at least follow it. Let me say it. Sorry.
It was, what was it? It was, like, lesbian sex is, like, transcends sex or something like that.
Right. Well, because it stems, I think, going back to the idea that women are defined in opposition to men because men are the sort of...
heteronorm.
The universal, the archetype.
Right.
And so that's the basis that we're comparing it to, and then women are defined in comparison to that. And then lesbian is a way of escaping the comparison system and sort of building a new system.
Right. And my understanding of I always why do I keep forgetting
it's a
how to
hard
say
name.
the name?
You gotta say it like you're French.
Est-ce que je peux aller au W?
Yeah, right.
Irigare? Anyway.
I would say Irigare, probably.
Irigare?
Yeah.
It seemed like they were talking about making women like their own universal or something like that.
Right.
Yeah. But yeah.
Yeah, I think probably about that.
Yeah. Yeah, and then, of course, I think all of these have their shortfalls in Butler's view, and I think the big shortfall is that it's still working through... I mean, it's kind of the same thing. I got the impression that it was kind of written in the same way that Marcuse was writing, where it's like you have to completely break out of the system in order to criticize it.
Yeah, right.
Which is, to your point, how it's in line with the critical theorists.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, the big point there that I have a big point by, like, there it is. She says, as Rose points out very clearly, the construction of a coherent sexual identity along the disjunctive axis of the feminine masculine is bound to fail. The disruption of this coherence through the inadvertent reemergence of the repressed reveal not only that identity is constructed, but that the prohibition that constructs identity is inefficacious. The paternal law ought to be understood not as a deterministic divine will, but as a perpetual bumbler preparing the ground for the insurrection against him. So this is Marcuse, it's the whole thing, because it's saying that the capitalist heteronormative system is bound to fail. It's fated to fail.
Right.
And it is itself establishing, like unwittingly, the conditions for the revolution against it.
Yeah. Well, and this is where, again, I don't know if we should read the Antichrist, but we could at some point by Nietzsche.
Uh-huh.
He basically elaborates, I think, in much clearer terms, how he feels like Christianity is this self-immolating religion.
Right.
It destroys, it makes the individual hate themselves, and it makes them kind of almost like tear down society. I just feel like you can, even though like Judith Butler wouldn't say she's a Christian or anything, it feels like the West, which has its Christian roots, a lot of this makes sense when you look at it with that Nietzschean perspective of like, all of these philosophies are just philosophies to destroy itself in some ways. It's like break down everything.
Right.
And yeah. And of course, the meek shall inherit the earth. I mean, the meek in this sense are the outcast.
Yes.
I mean, I think Butler is lesbian, right? It certainly wasn't easy to be a lesbian in the 90s.
Right.
I mean, it was getting easier, but, you know, it wasn't easy. They were the outcasts. And yeah, I mean, yeah, and it's this ressentiment that Nietzsche talks about, you know, this resentment that a sort of hyper-conscious individual has to sort of overthrow things and sort of replace it with whatever.
Right.
I mean, who knows with what. But yeah, I mean, all of that is to be said. Again, I'm sitting here saying I think that it's always good, again, to evaluate the conditions that you're in. I'm sort of very, very much an advocate of that. It's just always the question I come back to that I have, same with you, right, for anarchy. It's just like, what is it that we're replacing it with, you know? And are we going to be happy, I guess is the question. Will we ever be happy, first off? Maybe that's not a good benchmark.
Right. I don't know. Happiness is everything, but yeah.
Happiness is not everything, but it's not to be completely discounted.
I agree with that too. I don't want a crazy world. Like, I'm not looking to live in Mad Max.
Yes, you do. Well, it seems to be going that way. So,
but that's not because of me.
It's because of you. It's because of this podcast. How dare you?
Okay, so last bit that I had. Do you want to address the little incest paragraph?
Oh, you're talking about where they're talking about, like, you know, the mother, son. Right. I mean, we can.
It was just kind of weird.
Like it was that.
It felt a little Foucault all of a sudden.
Well, I didn't understand how this was a phallogocentric thing. Because I felt like she was saying it was like, this is because of men, basically, or because of the male-centric
taboo
vision.
on incest is because of men, right?
Yeah, which, okay. Sorry. Sorry, I'm not sorry. Sure, I mean, if you want to read it.
Well, I don't have to read it. I just mean, like, that it feels like, you know, like Foucault has all this weird stuff. There's always weird stuff like that in there.
It's very edgelordy.
Which is pretty funny, because when you watch Judith Butler, you would not imagine any edgelord anything.
No, so that's what I intend to do this week, is listen to some of her lectures and do a little bit more background reading.
Yeah.
But yeah, I haven't watched any sort of extra stuff.
Very professorly.
Very professorly, yeah. Well, I mean, and it's to your point that you were making with the Marcuse stuff, is how it's like a lot of this really revolutionary stuff is couched in extremely esoteric writing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And, you know, you wear a tweed coat and you smoke a pipe and then you say the craziest stuff.
But you say it in a way with
where nobody would understand what you said anyway.
Yeah. Until a few decades after, and you're like, oh, okay.
Actually, I had a comment, and I don't know if it's true, but I had a joke that it felt like she was paid by the word to write this, and then my comment is, it seems almost like writing in such a way to develop plausible deniability. Because nobody knows what you're talking about anyway.
Yes. I completely agree, though, that like the first chapter did not feel like it needed to be as long.
And the next two are even longer.
Yeah. Oy. But yeah, so we'll have, ostensibly we'll have my friend join us for the third one.
Oh, on this? Cool.
Yeah. Because he said he wanted to just kind of get a feel for it.
Yeah.
So he'll hop on the third episode.
Yeah, Mr. T.
Mr. T. I guess it'd be Mr. A. No, well, he could be Ninja Turtle. Yeah. And then after that, are we definitely doing it with the Reckless Muse?
Yeah. I haven't scheduled it. I have to send out the email, but yes.
Come on, dude.
Come on.
No time like the present.
Right. Yeah.
And yeah, I don't think any other exciting things. You have any gigs?
I have a lot, yeah. I'm playing at Mozart's tomorrow, and I have to look at my calendar.
Nice.
I'm playing at Boomers on Saturday, and then at Sahara Lounge next Friday, and Pootie's Roadhouse next Saturday, and Mozart's next Sunday.
Nice.
Yeah. Just a bunch.
You see Tom Segura again?
I haven't seen him since that one time. Yeah.
Cool.
All right.
I got nothing.
Okay. That's exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Cool.
See you guys next week.
Right. Bye.